Okay, thanks. And I'm giving this talk on behalf of both Ben and myself, so he couldn't make it. What we're focusing is this phenomenon, which we're going to call impersonal everywhere, and this is what we see in 1a, wherein many speakers of English can say something like everywhere in the Middle East eats hummus, with the reading that all of the people in the Middle East eat hummus. And what we'll show is that this stands in contrast to just saying everywhere eats hummus without specifying where, which is degraded. And so, back before the pandemic, before everything, we thought this was regional, we thought this was change in progress, and to some extent we still do. We thought this was a feature of Solent English, so in southern England, the Southampton Portsmouth area. And in 2, you actually see an example, an attested example from a tweet from someone from Portsmouth. Don't you think it's weird that everywhere apart from Portsmouth don't know what squinny means, and squinny is tumo in the local dialect. So what we've looked into this, and what we've found, and what I'll discuss today, is that this is possible where everywhere is restricted by this kind of locative, which I'll talk a bit about. And then we tested a bit more over the past year to the extent that we could, and we did find that it seems to be more widespread than just in that specific region. And so this usage in 3, again, everywhere on the coast eats fish and chips, contrasts with the kind of institutional usage, which we think is more standard. So those are things like in 4, everywhere will collect their fish for you if you ask them, or 5, linguistics was once a rare subject in higher education, but now everywhere in England has a linguistics department or a language department. And so we call this more institutional. This is about every shop and every university rather than every individual. And we'll come back to how we think that the kind of institutional use of everywhere, as in 4 and 5, was the precursor to the individual impersonal everywhere in 3 a bit later on. So we allude to some of the literature on metonymy here at the end of the slide. So here's the structure of the talk. I'll spend most of it talking about an acceptability study that we ran investigating what kind of element this everywhere is across different regions. And then I'll talk a little bit about the potential change in progress, which we might be seeing. I'll give a very rough outline of what the formal analysis could look like, and I'll conclude with a few open questions and things that we're still looking at. So many aspects of this are still work in progress, even though we think we have the main empirical picture more or less figured out. So again, we aim to test what kind of element this everywhere is, syntactically and semantically. So whether it's really the same thing as everyone, or whether it's some other kind of syntactic feature bundle. And the 2 main empirical findings are that, as a whole, speakers prefer to use this impersonal everywhere when they have an overt locative restrictor, as we call it, so on the coast, in England, and so on. And younger speakers are somewhat more accepting of this impersonal usage than older speakers. So I'll show that as well. So first, a bit about the study. We collected a bunch of argument structure diagnostics from the literature that have been used in studies of impersonal subjects, implicit arguments, to test what kind of element this is. So I list a few here. I'll go through a few of them. But you'll see whether you can control, whether you can bind, whether you can antecede a pronoun. And what we'll see next is that this kind of everywhere can basically do everything that a regular DP can or regular pronoun can, except it's not so good with passives. So I won't run through all of these, but I will go through quite a few to give you a feel for the data. And then we looked at a few other factors. So again, whether we require some kind of overt quantification with what we call a restrictor, and it looks like it does. So you can't leave out this on the coast in the UK, in the Middle East. We further tested whether this is not just about everywhere as some kind of quirky frozen form, whether it's compositional. So we tested whether you can have anywhere, somewhere, and nowhere with the expected readings, and it turns out that you can, right? So nowhere in the UK, nowhere in the world noticed this before, meaning nobody noticed this before. And we looked at some demographic factors to see whether they play a role, and we found that age is a significant predictor of people's preferences, but the other factors are not. So this was a 7-point acceptability judgment, acceptability task on a Likert scale. We ran this online. And when I refer to context, that's just the diagnostics listed previously, which again, we'll go through very soon. And so these were just coded as different levels of a context condition. And when I talk about restrictor, again, this is in England or no restrictor. And we had this, so each participant saw each item either with or without an overt restrictor. Didn't see the same one twice. And we also explicitly tested everywhere versus everyone. So that is our where condition. So we'd expect basically all of the items with everyone to be rated at ceiling, 6s or 7s. With more variation and maybe something more interesting going on for everywhere. So this leads to this kind of factorial design where we have the restrictor, yes or no, everywhere or everyone, one of 3 regions, which I'll get to in a moment, and the different kinds of diagnostics coded as context. And we had basically one exclamation for each. Again, we'll see some examples very soon. And we also had some figures, which were our gold standard. So we had 5 absolutely grammatical examples and 5 absolutely ungrammatical examples to calibrate participants' ratings according to. So each participant saw 46 trials in total. And then we can compare the different levels of the context, the different responses and the diagnostics to one another, right? Comparing the control condition to the passive condition, say, but also comparing them to the gold standards, to things that we know are grammatical in English and things that we know are ungrammatical in English. So before showing you what that looks like, just a word on our participants. So we recruited 256 participants from the general Southampton, Portsmouth area. This is all online via social networks, so traditional social networks and online social networks. And then for comparison, we ran this online on Prolific for participants from the UK, and I think we only got participants from England, so that's 139 before exclusions. And then we also ran another group on Prolific from North America, and there I think we only actually got participants from the US. So it was 73. All right, so good numbers, which is why I feel relatively comfortable saying something like we think we have a general idea of what the empirical picture is. I'll show you Z-transformed ratings. Right, so we got the raw ratings on a 7-point Likert scale, and Z-transformed them, or Z-transformed them, and fit them to your typical mixed effects linear regression model. And at the end of the study itself, our participants filled out some basic demographic information, age, gender, level of education, and a proxy for where they grew up based on part of their postcode. So that was for the post hoc analyses. All right, so a brief preview of what we're going to see. I won't even show any of the examples where we have everyone, because these responses were as ceiling as you'd expect. Where you have everywhere with the overt restrictor, it patterns almost like a full DPR pronoun, so I already mentioned that earlier. With no restrictor, everywhere is much less acceptable across the board, but makes no difference to everyone, so everyone is still fine. The youngest speakers, so the 18 to 29-year-old age group, were more accepting of most uses of this. And to the extent that we see a difference between regions, our UK-based participants seem to rate these constructions slightly higher than our US-based participants. All right, so there's a lot going on in this slide. Let me walk us all through it. This is what our result slides are going to look like. So these are our control conditions. So if we look at the boxes on the left, with the way the examples were always presented was we have a kind of context phrase and then the carrier, so a context sentence and then the actual test sentence. So our first row is an example of our grammatical gold standard items. So I've traveled a fair bit and different countries aren't all that different. People everywhere are the same, really. And so we have everywhere, and we also have everywhere in the world. So participants who saw this with the version with the restrictor saw what you see in parentheses in boldface in the world. That's our restrictor. And the participants who saw this without the restrictor only saw people everywhere are the same, really. And we have a few more examples of the gold standard. And somewhere downstairs, we have our gold standard ungrammatical. So these are ungrammatical in any variant of English that we're familiar with. So one example, my local library contains lots of books. I read most of them nowhere. So there's our examples of materials. On the right-hand side, what we have is our results. And so let's look at the panel on the top. So this is the ratings for the grammatical gold standard examples. So this is transformed from the raw Likert rating to the z-score. And you see it's somewhat negatively skewed. And so we have 3 pairs of bars. So on the left-hand side, we have our Solent participants. In the middle, we have our UK participants, our general non-Solent UK participants. And on the right-hand side, we have our US participants. And then in each pair, the one on the left, the slightly more red-orangey one, is the condition with the restrictor. And the one on the right, the more blue or purple one, is the one without the restrictor. And we also have a legend here. So, for example, what we see by looking at just the gold standard controls is that there's no difference in each of the regions whether you do or don't have a restrictor, which is what we'd expect. These examples should be perfectly grammatical. And maybe slightly lower ratings, the UK than Solent and US groups. The mean across all grammatical gold standard fillers is this dashed green line that you see on the top. So that is one way of orienting ourselves in the examples to follow towards what the baseline grammatical rating would be. And then if we look at the bottom, we have similarly the ratings for the ungrammatical gold standards. And here the ratings are very low. The same idea, and the dotted red line is the mean rating for an ungrammatical example. So again, we basically want to see where our items of interest fall between absolutely grammatical top in green and clearly ungrammatical unacceptable in the bottom. So far, nothing particularly interesting has been going on linguistically, because these are just the expected grammatical and ungrammatical items. But that's what the examples look like. So now let me take you through a few of our actual test conditions. So here's our simple agentive condition. We have our context is eating fish and chips, a regional thing. No, these days everywhere in Britain eats fish and chips, or these days everywhere eats fish and chips. So we have a slightly larger plot here on the left-hand side, but it's the same idea, right? So dashed green line at the top, grammatical, gold standard, dotted red line at the bottom, ungrammatical. For each pair in a region, the left-hand side is with the restrictor and the right-hand side is without the restrictor. And so what we see, for example, is that across the board, these are not as good as the grammatical gold standards, but they're definitely better than the ungrammatical ones. And that's a kind of pattern we'll see throughout, right? So they're not terrible, they're not perfect, they're somewhere in the middle, which is, I guess, what you'd expect for something that is substandard in one way or another. So Ben has this in his idiolect dialect, but I don't. So we can see, for example, if we look at, say, the pair of bars in the middle for our UK participants, there's a clear difference between the ratings with the restrictor or without. So they like this example much better. They rate it much higher when they do have the restrictor, in Britain in this case, than when they don't have it. This kind of pattern is what we saw when we tested some of our other conditions. So we had different kinds of adverbs, we had different kinds of modals, and this is the same general kind of pattern. The ratings are somewhere in the middle with a preference for the restrictor. So as I mentioned earlier, with that in place, we wanted to see whether this is some kind of frozen form or it's compositional. So we looked at anywhere, nowhere, and somewhere. So let me just show you the actual items. So in one, we're testing anywhere. So most Middle Eastern religions forbid their followers from eating eagles. But I wonder if anywhere in the Middle East does actually eat eagles. So this is ungrammatical for me, but you see at the top right, this is more or less fine for most of our participants, especially with the restrictor. And then in 2, we have nowhere. Some rows are more popular than others. In fact, Prince William is very popular, but basically nowhere in the UK likes Camilla. So you have the ratings for that. They're a bit lower. And then in 3, somewhere in the world probably does eat cat. And so we have somewhere here at the bottom panel. Now, differences between these items, so between anywhere, nowhere, and somewhere, they might be random. They might reflect something in the syntax or semantics that we haven't caught. It might be just the context that we happen to choose. In this case, there's not enough data to tell. But overall, this does look compositional, so especially with anywhere and somewhere, and to some extent even nowhere. So it really looks so far like we have, some kind of quantifier and where. And the next thing we wanted to check was whether this really behaves like a full DP. And so we tested whether it can control and whether it can bind. And the answer, again, is basically yes. So here's our control condition. Ad campaigns against smoking have been running since the 90s. Pretty much everyone in the UK has been trying to quit since. And here are the results for control. Again, preference for the restrictor pattern across all groups. And I just reproduced a pattern for the simple agentive here on the left-hand side, just for comparison. And I forgot to mention that, of course, these are examples from our UK version of the experiment when we ran this with the US participants. So we tweaked some of the examples, changed some of the phrasings. So this everywhere can control. And we tested whether it can bind. So in one, we have example with themselves. So we have 3 anaphors, themselves in 1, each other in 2, and their possessor in 3. And here, all 3 were very similar to one another, collapse them into this one panel that you see here. Again, the same kind of pattern, a preference for the restrictor, in this case, especially for our UK participants. So far, we've seen that this is more or less acceptable, especially with the restrictor. It is compositional. It does behave like a full DP in the sense that it can control and bind. And the last thing we checked was special argument structure configuration, so all kinds of promoted subjects. So we tested psych verbs, which I won't show you now, but you can ask me about later, but they pattern the same as the other 2 unaccusatives, and, well, to a lesser extent, passives. So for unaccusatives, we have a directed motion unaccusative in 1. People always take their jobs most seriously on a Monday. Basically, everywhere in the Western world arrives at work bright and early on a Monday, but late on a Friday. And we have a change of state unaccusative in 2. Changes in the time of sunrise are known to influence how we sleep. For example, everywhere in the Northern Hemisphere wakes up earlier in summer than in winter. And again, these are specifically readings that talk about individuals rather than institutions. And here, the contrast between having the restrictor and not having the restrictor is fairly clear. And the items in 2 are actually rated slightly higher than those in 1, if that's the sort of thing that interests you with regards to different kinds of unaccusatives. The last kind of context that I want to show you is the passives, and this is the one case which was statistically significantly different than the others. So here's our example. The financial crisis of 2008 hit industry hard. During the crisis, everywhere in the industrial Northeast was made redundant. And here the ratings are fairly low. We still have the contrast where the ratings are higher with the restrictor, but these are much lower. So they are still significantly different than the ungrammatical gold standards, but they are also significantly different than any of the other conditions that I just showed you. But other than that, this everywhere seems to pass all the syntactic tests that we thought were relevant for a full noun phrase or pronoun, especially if it has this restrictor. So this is the summary. Again, I didn't show you everyone, but those were basically at ceiling. Everywhere you get the impersonal reading, but really only if you have this restrictor, in which case more or less behaves like a full DP. But it's less acceptable as the subject of a passive verb. And to some extent, it looks like the UK speakers like these more than US speakers. So the next thing is I'll briefly tell you about a potential change in progress. This really depends more on the numerical output of the statistical analyses. So as mentioned earlier, we ran a linear mixed effects model. We had item and participant as random intercepts. And though I'm just going to present some of these findings now is kind of an informal way of just talking about the interactions and where you see an effect. So there are other ways of presenting this data, so we still need to find a nice way of visualizing this, and there's Bayesian analyses that one could run. But I think the basic point will come across. So when we conduct the analyses, we take as reference levels ungrammatical as context, so we compare everything to the ungrammatical gold standards, and we just use Solent as our regional reference level, just because we need to pick one. And so what happens is, when you look at the interaction between restrictor and having everywhere, it's significant and you have a positive coefficient. So that tells us, that's the way in which the stats tell us that ratings do improve when you have the restrictor compared to when you don't have the restrictor. And the interaction of restrictor and region was also significant, and here are the coefficients, and this basically means that the UK ratings are higher than the US ratings. Okay, so that's what I mean when I say that the restrictor drives acceptability. So now what I want to briefly plot is results by age group across the different contexts. And so if you squint, what you might be able to see, especially if you look at, say, the UK and also the Solent bars, so we have 18 to 29-year-olds on the left-hand side, and then older and older participants, is that the ratings seem to be visually slightly higher the more you go to the left-hand side and to the younger speakers. And this does seem to be the case. So it does seem to be the case that 18 to 29-year-olds give higher ratings than 30 to 49-year-olds than the rest, especially with the restrictor. And this is slightly different depending on whether you look at the UK participants or the US participants, but across the board, the 18 to 29-year-olds rate this higher. So, to us, this could look like might look like change in progress, but it could also reflect something else, right? It could also reflect some conservativity on the part of our older participants, for example. Okay, so this just repeats what I already said, so I'll skip that, and we will make the data available online. There's lots of different ways in which one could dig into this. So a couple more things before I conclude. One is just to give you an idea of what we think the formal analysis would look like. So there's two steps. The first is this institutional use of everywhere, which we thought is the source. And I'm bringing this up because this is our current working assumption, where we have everywhere as a subject and a specifier voice P in this case. So this is everywhere, meaning every shop, everywhere in England. And so we need some kind of D features and phi features on this where. We're not actually familiar with any formal work on how this kind of metonymy might work in syntax. So if you have any pointers, we'd be happy to hear them. But if we take this as our starting point, then we can say that whatever happens next in the transition from the institutional use to the individual use is you kind of lose the ability to have this where on its own, and you need to basically value these phi features. There's a couple more things that can kind of need to be figured out. So we think this everywhere is restricted to human subjects, so we need some kind of human feature, though we haven't actually tested that yet. I haven't shown that. And we need a way of talking about the restrictor restriction. So it could be some kind of selectional property. It could be something about the locative feature on where that needs to be valued a certain way. And what might be relevant there is the sort of things that can be restrictors, and this is the final point before wrapping up. So again, we didn't test this directly. This is from introspection and from asking around. It looks like the restrictor has to be locative and has to be large. So when we see an 8 everywhere in the UK, on the coast in Europe. Smaller locations, everywhere in the city or in Constance or in the restaurant drinks tea, is not so good. And non-locative restrictors and the 10 through 11 are also out. So in this generation, everywhere knows Mary, everywhere that has a queen, and so on. So that still needs to be remains to be accounted for. So there are a few points for discussion here. I'll mention them briefly. You find few tested examples, and you find people saying, I can understand that, but I wouldn't say it, and then people give pretty good ratings. So we have one of our participants here saying, WTF is a squinny. Nowhere says that. Right, so there's also this contrast between what you can get judgments on and what people actually say. I mentioned that we may or may not be tracking change in progress. We still need to find a way of honing in on that. I mentioned the strength of restrictors and what kind of restrictors you might have. That's in 3 and 4. And as I mentioned, we do need a good formal way of talking about metonymy in order to understand this phenomenon and its development, its evolution. So the speakers of English appear to be able to use everywhere as an impersonal subject. I can't, but this seems to be very widespread. We think this comes from this institutional or metonymic everywhere which becomes individual everywhere, and younger speakers are more accepting of it, which might indicate a change in progress, but still many different things to discuss and possible avenues to pursue. So looking forward to hear what you have to think about this. Thank you.